Hello, everybody. Welcome to this podcast about a wonderful sustainable development project that's ongoing outside New York. We'll start by introducing ourselves and why we're here. Nev, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, sure. My name is Nev Derwachter. I am a second year master's student at New York University in the Center for Global Affairs, concentrating in international development and humanitarian assistance.
And my name is Brian Waters. I am in the same program with the same concentration. Nev and I met in this program, and we we are participating in this project to shed light on a sustainable development issue, or rather, um, the promotion of mitigating of an issue and sort of healing New York spaces and contextualizing its history and bringing it to life. Um, so, do you want to shed a little bit of light on what we're discussing today and how we came upon this topic?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about Freshkills Park in Staten Island. And we came across this specific project because we were taking a class in sustainable development and we were tasked with doing some community engagement beyond just, reading our textbooks. And we were fortunate enough to eventually be connected with a professor at NYU who has done very extensive research on green spaces and parks and the from an environmental justice perspective. And one of those green spaces is the Freshkills Park that we're going to be focusing on a little bit more. And so, more specifically, we are here to look at the history of the site, the transition that it has undergone, and what the implications of that are for the future and for similar projects like it.
Yeah, so there is a wealth of research about fresh kills located on Staten Island, and it is a fantastic work in progress that has involved many stakeholders, and there's been a lot of passion and love put into it. So, a bit of a background on it is more recently, before it was being turned into a park, it actually was the world's largest garbage facility, and it was producing and having sent to thousands and thousands of tons of garbage every single day. And it was horrible for the environment. It was a very big nuisance and health hazard and very destructive for people that lived near it. And overall, just sort of absolute destruction of its land. So, what we're seeing here, though, is absolutely turning it around and building something wonderful out of it. So, Nev and I actually went to visit it very recently, and you're not able to visit the whole thing yet, but we want to, in this podcast, for all of you listening, what we want to do is we want you to get excited about this, maybe get involved, learn about its history, and maybe even, yeah, participate in the building up of it. So, what it is now is it is a work in progress park that is three, I believe three, several times the size of Central Park. And it's accessible from Manhattan. It's not the easiest to get there, but among our sources, we're going to put directions or an article that explains how to get there. So, what were your sort of expectations before we visited the park? And did they sort of match what we actually saw? What did you describe sort of what you saw when we were there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, despite knowing in theory that it was three times the size of Central Park, I don't think I really had a good grasp on what that meant. So, I was really astounded by the sheer scale of the park. I did have the perception that all of the kind of notable stops and things to see and do throughout the park. I thought that they were going to be a little more easily accessible, like, oh, we could just go from the pollinator garden to, the bird watching tower, whatever it was. And we'll talk about that in a bit, but that was not necessarily the case. But something aside from the size that I was really impressed by was how far the land has come. If you would have told me that that was a, garbage dump, having done no prior research, I never would have believed you. It's really incredible what it has transformed to. Yeah, Brian, what did you think?
Yeah, I sort of was astonished by how beautiful it was, and like you were saying, how it didn't, you wouldn't, if no one had told you what it was as recently as the 1990s, early 2000s, if no one had told me, I definitely would have never known. And in fact, I would compare it to, for those of you who have maybe been to Prospect Park in New York, it gave this feeling not only of escapism from the urban life, but it also genuinely just felt like you're totally immersed in nature. And when, from what Nev and I were able to see, you you see a large body of water off in the distance, and we were able to see some, not we weren't able to see a ton of wildlife, but we definitely saw things in the way of insects and smaller wildlife that Nev will talk a lot about, and I can kind of share my observations, but that's more Nev's specialty, especially with bees, where we'll get into it. But it you feel like you're in sort of an untouched area almost, which is at the end of the day the goal, and you want it to be this lovely nature. And so there is a very cool bird watching tower that is accessible from where we were, and you can go there whenever. And we actually, when we went up there, we saw immediately when we went up there, we saw a bird just kind of sitting there on the corner of one of the railings. And then we actually, I don't remember, I remember we kind of looked, there was like a research truck off to the side, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was.
And so you could see, this active work that's happening. And we saw, I believe he was a park ranger who was very friendly and talked with us. So it's a big work in progress, and there's a lot to unpack about it. So um, what did you notice about what types of plants that were there? I found out some interesting information about how we first got started with planting plants there. But what did you see a lot of or not a lot of when we were there, before I get into how it started?
Yeah, so I think the most obvious things that stood out to me were the variety of wildflowers, all native species, which is something I'll touch on later. Lots of natural grasses. It's not your perfectly manicured lawn by any means. It is a wild space, but it is very artfully controlled in a way that makes it accessible and friendly to the public.
Yeah, and I like that, what you're saying about how it's not necessarily manicured like a garden. It adds to they're sort of recreating, totally natural, real spaces, and letting the ecosystem run its course with native species and whatnot. And what's incredible is you hear about all of this work that's been done over the last several decades. Someone interesting connected to this project is Dr. Stephen Handel from Rutgers University. He is of the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources. And so, for those of you who don't know, and we learned this as we started, obviously, as well, is one of the beginning processes of eliminating the hazard that this land was is putting a very thick layer of different materials directly on top of all of the waste to cover it up. And part of that involved, I'm not sure exactly how thick it was, but clay, this sort of clay cap covering all the land to really just bury the waste that was there and kind of start over on top of it. And a concern that was there originally was if we plant things like trees there, are roots from plants going to break up this clay cap? And Dr. Stephen Handel, along with people researching with him, they did a study and tried and planted and wanted to see if this would happen. And they found that this will not be an issue. And you see something wonderful in that back in the 90s when they did this, they planted trees like the green ash tree. And that tree, from what I've learned, is known for being able to survive in harsh environmental conditions and being able to persist and be resilient. And now you flash forward to today, there was a guide that we saw from, let's point out this tree and this type of tree. And now there's green ash trees in Freshkills Park today. So it's just great to see things go well and this work succeed. And sort of before we continue with the sustainable development aspect, we really want to talk about the history farther back of this land. So Nev, did you want to introduce that and maybe shed some light on some things about New York in general that people might not know?
Yeah, exactly. So it is really important to trace the history of this land all the way back to its original inhabitants, because that story has important implications for how we proceed with this revitalization. So the original inhabitants of the land were the indigenous Lenape people, also referred to as the Delaware people, and they had this really beautiful synergistic relationship with the land. And not to romanticize it, but it is something that has more or less um, been degraded over time in our modern iterations of our culture. So they didn't necessarily view land as something that could be owned. They lived in harmony with nature, they took from it and they gave to it. And so when the Europeans arrived, they did not share this perspective on the land. The Europeans' land was property that could be owned. And so it led to really this false sale of the land of Manhattan and parts of New York City, um, to the Dutch, who ended up claiming that land as their own because they were under the impression that they owned it, and ultimately they settled there. And the original inhabitants were forced to relocate, primarily towards the western um, part of the country. And Lenape culture, even though they were displaced, their culture and their language and the elements of their society still exist in modern New York City if you know where to look. So there are especially names of streets and towns and even landmarks that can be traced back. The word Manhattan itself is a Lenape word for island. Um, and we're going to attach links that will guide you to these monuments and other site markers that are relevant to the Lenape people. So you can kind of explore that if you're interested. Um, but I think this connection is really something that has been lost over time. I don't know, Brian. What do you think? Do you think a lot of people know about this?
Yeah, so it's I, I cannot speak for everybody. Of course, I personally had not known about the history of where I'm currently living in this sense in Manhattan. I did not know where the word Manhattan came from. I did not know about the Lenape people, and it's been very um, thought provoking and I think very important to learn about their history and also to see the continuity of it. So, for example, there is an organization that is called Lenape Center, where they discuss how they're a nonprofit that is working toward developing exhibitions, art, music, education, and lectures, all toward learning about Lenape culture. And they also importantly recognize and say on their website that they don't speak directly for these nations, and they recognize that they still have their active governments and societies that also speak for themselves. So for them to be able to still tell their story and talk about their history is so important. And it's great to see that there are efforts to keep it alive and maintain it. So, as far as the share it, discussing it in terms of the land in New York, you see these connections to the past where we read that, for example, one animal that was there that was a big part of life there at the time was clams and other shelled animals like that in the water that were quite popular, and that there was even sometimes clothing items that were made out of them as well. And now, if you look to the present, you see in Freshkills today, there have been projects to make sure to revitalize these bivalved animals, especially for reasons that they can work to reduce pollutants in the environment. So you see this connection here of history and um, working toward the future and helping the environment, and also the connection to the people that originally lived there. So I think that it's very important to to discuss these things and the connections to that brings all of this together. So even with a creation story from the Lenape people that Nev and I had read about, where it involves a turtle, and those are another animal population that are being cared for today in the Fresh Kills area again, where I read an article that discusses how if turtles are able to survive and also thrive, hopefully in an area that is can be read as an indication that this area is doing well as far as nature goes. And per Fresh Kills, you can see that there is a turtle population that is starting to be able to survive, at least in the medium term. So we're seeing all of this good news and this bringing back of what was lost in its time as a garbage facility. So let's talk about leaning more into this nature aspect and the animals. What would you say as so Nev here, if you want to talk a little bit about your background as with bees and whatnot, do you want to maybe introduce your experience with that and try and connect that as well to what we've seen in Fresh Kills?
Yeah, absolutely. So I specialize in apiculture, which is basically the study of bees. Um, Personally, I've been a beekeeper for a few years now. I also work with the Bee Conservancy, which is dedicated to not only preserving the species of honeybees, but also supporting habitats for other native pollinators as well. So this is really my bread and butter. And even though my heart is with the bees, I do have to acknowledge that all pollinators are super important. And those include butterflies, flies, wasps, birds, and even some other animals all support the work of pollination. Um, and again, just to kind of differentiate between honeybees, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of bees, but we really want to pay attention to native species like bumblebees, leafcutter bees, carpenter bees, mason bees, all of these other different types. Um, and these pollinators are really important for the revitalization of the Freshkills project. as with restoring any ecosystem, really. So, first of all, they encourage this genetic diversity by connecting male and female plants across really broad geographic regions. So, honeybees in particular, they can forage up to 3 to 5 miles away. So they're really strengthening biodiversity in the local area and creating a more complex food web. And something that I did not know that I found really interesting was that bees can also aid in water filtration because they pollinate the plants that are filtering the water, like water lilies, for instance. Um, Another great benefit of improving our bee and pollinator health is that it improves soil fertility. So 70% roughly of bee species are actually ground nesting bees. So they burrow and make tunnels and little caverns in the ground where they will lay their eggs and do their thing. And in doing so, they aerate the soil and they also transfer pollen and nectar, which contributes to this nutrient cycle, which is, essential for our biodiversity. And they also support other wildlife, which we don't always think about. Most directly, they are a food source for, birds or other insects that are eating bees, but they also pollinate plant species that other, animals or insects are eating, and they pollinate flowers and plants that other species are using for their homes. So, especially birds or spiders, even snakes, they're making all of those habitats possible. And so they're what we refer to as a keystone species. So they really support both human and animal interaction in our ecosystem.
Yeah, so I was thinking about that, the keystone species, as you were leading up to that. Can you expand a little bit on what that means again? For maybe for me and also for the listeners, I see it feels very important with this, but I don't remember exactly what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as if we think about a keystone arch, the keystone itself is the stone at the top center of the arch. And so you can kind of imagine animals on one side and humans on the other, and bees kind of at this pinnacle. So they're bridging this animal human divide by supporting this ecosystem that can maintain both interests.
Okay,
Mhm.
that's fascinating. So it seems like that, yeah, there's a lot of really that bees and these pollinators are doing quite a bit of the work, and but they also need our help too. So there's the project with the pollinator garden that happened. Can you maybe explain a little bit about with mugwort what that is and what people were doing at the pollinator garden at Freshkills as far as that goes?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a couple different efforts at Freshkills alone to support pollinators and their habitat. There is a designated pollinator garden outside of the art studio and gallery space. Unfortunately, we didn't get to take a look at that, but as it is my understanding that there's blackberry, blueberry, and winterberry bushes there, which are all very appealing to bees and pollinators when they flower. And the other project is the Schmuel Park Pollinator Garden. This was established in 2020 by the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation staff, community members, and even high school volunteers. So I think that that's a really beautiful way of showing how all of these different people and parts of the community are really coming together. And then, in reference to your question about mugwort, mugwort is actually an invasive species.
Oh,
And yeah, and so what that means is that it's kind of choking out room for native plants. Um, and we really want native plants, which are plants that occur naturally in a specific region or ecosystem without any direct or indirect human intervention. So they know what to do. We don't need to help them, and we really love those. Um, especially because non-native plants are often sterile, which means that they don't produce any food for the pollinators.
Okay.
So that endangers native species then. And some of the native species that were planted at the Schmull Park Pollinator Garden include purple lovegrass, Nantucket juneberry, white snakeroot, orange butterfly weed, evening primrose, and common milkweed. And in doing so, we've seen monarch butterflies, we've seen some really beautiful species of wasps, actually, Asian lady beetles, common eastern bumblebees, even hoverflies. So their efforts have been very successful so far. Um, and then, in terms of those species that they're attracting not only honeybees but all of these native species, as I mentioned. And those native species are specialist pollinators, which means that they have evolved over time to only pollinate certain species of plants, whereas generalist pollinators, like honeybees, for instance, they are not picky. They will pollinate anything. So, in a healthy ecosystem, we need to have both generalists and specialists, and Freshkills is doing a great job in facilitating that.
That's really great to hear. And yeah, this multi specialization approach you see not just with the different animals like you're talking about, but also with different people. Like you're saying, it's very cool that you have school students and experts and everything in between with people getting involved. And that sort of reminds me of another important part of Fresh Kills, which is what's been dubbed the living dock. And if you look up the living dock, because you can't quite visit it yet in person, it it's of course in the water, and it's made from, I believe it was made from recycled materials. And what is cool about it is it's helping a lot of aquatic animals as well as animals that live partially in the water, partially out, and animals that like to live near the water. And what I also think is great about that is you see a lot of outside help coming. For example, I read that I believe Patagonia helped to pay for it, and you see there this recognition by companies and by the corporate world in general how important things like fresh kills are. And you also see, honestly, a lot of evidence of success on why it matters, not just for the health of the world, but also people genuinely want that. So I don't know, for all of you listening, how many of you have been to the High Line in New York, but it is another really interesting sustainable development project that is very worth seeing. So it used to be an above ground subway track, and now when one visits, the entire thing has been turned into a beautiful nature walk. So you get to walk along this path that subway cars used to take. And now, rather than that, you see outdoor amphitheaters, beautiful art projects, and not to mention, you'll see a lot of plants, and you'll even see a lot of plaques and signage that's discussing sort of what the plants are and their background. And I remember, I believe, seeing quite a few bees there and a lot of different pollinators roaming around the area. And you see here with the success of such a thing, how it's now a very popular tourist destination. Something can be it can be multiple things. It can be very fun to visit and enjoy. It can be, like we were saying earlier, synergistic with the environment. It can be productive for the environment. And it can also be, financially lucrative. Those things don't need to happen separately in a vacuum. It could bring people from anywhere excited to come see that, because I believe that that is worthy to go see, just like I believe that Fresh Kills is worthy to go see. And so it's just a very exciting prospect. So, like what Nev was saying earlier with the Mugwort project, and you can actually try to become involved in your own project there. So although you can't necessarily just go to Freshkills right now, on their website you can submit a form to create and send in your proposal for a volunteer project to help Freshkills, which of course very likely would entail you going there. So you get to go there. Obviously, you get to see it and enjoy it, but you can also contribute to making it better and making it more ready for wider public use. So projects like what Nev was discussing, I saw a project where people, were just helping doing something as simple as cleaning it up. Um, I'll have to double check this later, but I think I saw one where people were helping in some way with building birdhouses. And, there's a lot to be done with such a big area. And you see this accountability, not to sort of get off topic, but it just made me think of how cool it is that you get now where it was so hazardous before. And now we read that they have to monitor and want to monitor, obviously, the air quality so intensely that for some pollutants, it's measured, they take new measurements as often as every day for certain things that they need to look out for. So the idea is to create a safe, healthy, fun, and just great place to go. So, um, on top of that, we really suggest that you guys apply to go do something like that. You could be an individual, you could be doing this through your company, your nonprofit, your volunteer organization, your school. They accept all sorts of applications to go help. Um, so, Nev, what else did you have to say as far as the connection to the sustainable development goals? I know that that has big implications as well.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really unique about Fresh Kills is the intention behind the revitalization and transformation that we're seeing. Obviously, there are a lot of places and land around the world and particularly in the United States that are protected and preserved in the state that they're in, and that is, I don't want to downgrade that. That is absolutely essential. We need that. But because Fresh Kills did have this kind of tragic and incredible backstory of being this giant landfill, the amount of energy and time and motivation that it took to, you're not just starting at zero, you're almost starting from negative. So the amount that it took to move that needle all the way to the point where it is now, I think is really inspiring, and I think it bodes well for the future of not only Fresh Kills but similar initiatives that are in this vein of sustainable development, because that's the type of momentum that we need to be seeing and that we need to continue to build on moving forward.
Thank you for sharing that. Um, so I think this is a great place to leave our motivated listeners to get involved and learn more about this, learn about its history, its culture, and importantly as well, its future. So I want to thank all of you for tuning in and listening to hear about an exciting development in New York. And is there anything that you wanted to add to close up, Nev?
No, I just want to, tag on to that and say that if you are fortunate enough to be able to see this for yourself, it will change the way that you navigate New York City as a whole. And that is a really beautiful thing that I hope you all can experience.
Yes. We hope to maybe run into you all there. And thank you again for everybody for listening. Take care.
Thank you.